Hello, my darling, and welcome to today's story time. Today we are reading King Arthur and His Knights, The Good Sword Excalibur. If you like what you hear, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And now on with our story. The Good Sword Excalibur. Soon after the crowning of King Arthur, he was journeying through the land with Merlin, the wise old magician, when they met a knight who challenged Arthur to combat. The two fought, and at last the knight wounded Arthur severely. In the end, the knight was victorious, but he had lost so much blood that he could go no further. Merlin took him to a good hermit, who healed his wound in 3 days. Then the king departed with Merlin, and as they were slowly riding along, he said, "I am still weak from the blood I have lost, and my sword is broken." "Do not fear," said Merlin. "You shall lose no more blood, and you shall have a good sword. Ride on trustfully with me." They rode in silence until they came to a lake, large and quiet, and as beautiful in color as a pearl. While Arthur was looking at its beauty, he became suddenly aware of 3 tall women with fair, sweet faces, standing on the bank. "Who are they?" the king asked. "3 queens, who shall help you at your worst need," answered Merlin. "Now look out upon the lake again." Arthur turned his eyes upon the lake and saw that in the distance a slight mist had arisen. Through it the figure of a lady glided over the surface of the water. Her robe appeared to be made of waves, which streamed away in flowing curves from her body. Her head and shoulders seemed wrapped in foam, tinted with the colors of the rainbow, and her arms glittered with sparkles which came from bubbles of water. She was so wonderful that Arthur looked at her for some time before he asked softly, "Who is she?" "She is the Lady of the Lake," said Merlin. "She lives in a rock in the middle of the lake. See, she is coming towards us. Look at what is beyond her in the water." Arthur looked and saw rising above the surface of the water an arm clothed in pure white. This arm held a huge cross-hilted sword, so brilliant that Arthur's eyes were dazzled. When the Lady of the Lake approached nearer, he said, "Damsel, what sword is that? I wish it were mine, for I have none." The lady smiled, saying, "Step into yonder boat, row to the sword, and take it, together with the scabbard." So Arthur entered a little boat that was tied to the shore and rowed out to the sword. As he took it and the scabbard, all gleaming with jewels, the hand and arm vanished into the lake, and when Arthur looked about, the 3 queens and the Lady of the Lake were also gone. As Arthur, still gazing at the sword, rowed to shore, Merlin said to him, "My lord Arthur, which pleases you more, sword or scabbard?" "In truth," replied the king, "the sword." "Let me assure you," said Merlin, smiling gravely, "that the scabbard is worth 10 of the sword. While you have it with you, you shall never lose blood. No, no matter how sorely you are wounded. So see that you guard it well." The king, who was looking at the sword, sighed. "There is writing on the sword," he said. "True, my lord, written in the oldest tongue in the world." "Take me on one side," said Arthur, "and cast me away on the other. I am glad to take the sword, but it saddens me to think of casting it away." Merlin's face grew sad too. He was so wise that he knew what was going to happen in the future, and he was well aware that when the time came to cast the sword away, much evil would have befallen the good King Arthur. But he knew that the time was very far off, so he said, "You have taken the sword. Now use it to make justice and right prevail in all the land. Do not think of casting it away until you must." Arthur grew joyful again as he felt the strength of the good sword in his hand, and the two rode cheerfully forward through the country. Although Arthur had been crowned king, he was by no means sure that all the nobles of the land would accept him as ruler. In accordance with the custom of the time, he gave a feast in order to find out who were his friends and who were his enemies. All who came to the feast would, he supposed, consent to be his followers. He chose the largest hall in London and had the walls hung with rich cloths. Upon the floor, strewn with rushes, were placed trestles, and across these boards were laid. Upon them fine wooden linen was spread, and golden salt cellars, wine bowls, and water jugs set about. When the guests assembled, there were so many that Arthur was delighted, for he thought they were all his friends. He sat at the head of the table, and Sir Hector sat at the head of the other. Arthur wore a gold crown on his head, but it was no brighter than his hair, and the blue turquoises with which it was set were no bluer than his eyes. From his shoulders to the ground hung a magnificent red robe with gold dragons embroidered upon it. The cooks and squires came in from the kitchen carrying food, their ruddy faces beaming from the heat of the fires. First of all, 60 boars' heads were borne in on silver platters, then followed on golden dishes peacocks and plovers, which had been so skillfully cooked that their bright colors were preserved. After the guests had eaten all they cared for of this food, tiny roasted pigs were brought in and set on all fours upon the tables. By this time, all the gold and silver goblets which had been filled with wine needed refilling. Then the squires carried in beautiful white swans on silver platters, and roasted cranes and curlews on plates that glowed like the sun. After that came rabbit stewed in sweet sauce, and hams and curries. The last course consisted of tarts and preserves, dates and figs, and pomegranates. The supper began about 5 o'clock, and the guests ate and drank into the night. Although it was past Easter time, the weather was a little cold, and so upon the stone flagging between the long 2 tables, the king ordered fires to be lighted. The bright flames darted up, flashing on the gold threads woven in the hangings of the walls, and on the steel armor of the lords, and gleaming on the jewels set in the gold and silver goblets, which the squires were carrying about. At one side sat a band of musicians singing the glories of King Arthur, and of the folk tales of his ancestors and people. accompanying themselves on their harps. After the guests had risen from the tables and gone to their camps, Arthur sent messengers to them with rich gifts of horses and furs and gold. But most of the lords received the messengers scornfully. "Take back these gifts to the beardless boy, who has come of low blood," they said. "We do not want him. We have come here to give him gifts of hard blows with our hard swords." The messengers were astonished to hear these things spoken of their good king. Nevertheless, they told Arthur all that had been said to them. He sent no answer back, but he called together all of the lords whom he was sure were loyal to him, and asked their advice. They said to him, "We cannot give you advice, but we can fight." "You speak well, my lords," answered Merlin, "and I thank you for your courage. Will you take the advice of Merlin? You know that he has done much for me, and he is very wise." The lords and barons answered that they would do whatever Merlin asked. When Merlin came to the council hall, he said, "I warn you that your enemies are very strong. They have added to their numbers so that now you have against you 11 mighty kings." At this, the lords looked dismayed. "Unless our Lord Arthur has more men than he can find in his own realm," said Merlin, "he will be overcome and slain. Therefore, I give you this counsel. There are 2 brothers across the sea. Both are monarchs, and both are very strong. One is King Ban of Benwick, and the other is King Bors of Gaul. Now these 2 have an enemy, also a powerful ruler. Therefore, send to the brothers, King Bors and King Ban, who are now both in Benwick, and say to them that if they will help Arthur in his war against the 11 kings, Arthur will help them against their common enemy." "That is very good counsel," said the king and the lords. So they chose Sir Ulfius and Sir Brastias as messengers, and these 2 hurried away, hopeful of success. When they reached the town in Benwick where King Bors and King Ban were, knights came forth to receive them and hear their message. As soon as it was learned from whom they had come, they were led into the presence of the brothers. Both were very large men. King Bors was dark and was dressed in black armor. King Ban was dark too. The colors that he wore on his shield were green and gold. He was the father of Sir Lancelot, the knight who afterwards became the most powerful of the followers of Arthur. The 2 kings received Sir Ulfius and Sir Brastias with much favor. "Tell King Arthur," they said, "that we will come to him as quickly as we can." And they gave splendid gifts to Sir Ulfius and Sir Brastias, and they hurried back to Arthur with the message. In a short time, King Bors and King Ban arrived with 10,000 of their soldiers, and as Arthur had 10,000, they felt certain of victory. They went into Wales, a country which Arthur's followers knew well, and waited confidently for their enemy. The 11 kings collected a great host of 60,000 men, 50,000 on horseback and 10,000 on foot. They marched towards the place where Arthur was, and set up their camp near a wood about a mile distant. When Merlin knew this, he said to Arthur and his 2 kings, "This is my advice. Set upon your enemies at midnight when they are unprepared, and then you will have the advantage." So Arthur and the 2 royal brothers and the 20,000 soldiers crept up to where the elven kings and their men lay. They took a road circling round the wood. Moving with great caution, they drew nearer and nearer until they could see first campfires in a circle around the white tents, and then, against the flashing flames, the dark figures of the men who were keeping guard. Sometimes they were afraid that the noise they made would alarm their enemies, but on account of a heavy windstorm, they were unheard. When his men were quite near, Arthur gave the word of command. The whole army uttered a great shout and ran forward in companies upon their enemies. In a few minutes, they had knocked down most of the tents and killed many of the soldiers. It was a dreadful thing to be attacked in the dark without warning, but the 11 kings were brave men, even though they were so unjust to Arthur in trying to take his kingdom from him, and made a good fight. Perhaps they would have made a better one if they had known how few the men were under Arthur. Before day dawned, Merlin told Arthur to draw back his troops. This he did, leaving about 10,000 of the enemy dead behind him. He, however, had not lost very many men. At daybreak, Arthur and his followers saw that the lay of the land could be used to their advantage. Between them and the enemy was a narrow road, bounded on one side by a lake, and on the other side by a dense wood. One part of this wood, however, was thin enough to allow men to hide in it. "Now," said Merlin, "let King Bors and King Ban take their soldiers and hide in the wood for a long time. Then, my lord Arthur, stand up before the enemy with your men." "Why shall we do this?" asked Arthur. The wise old man replied, "Because when the 11 kings see how few in number your troops are, they will let you proceed down the passage. They will think that if you march close to them, they can overcome you. But you can fill up this narrow road and more men from the wood. Then the enemy cannot surround you." "That seems very good," said Arthur. "And at last," continued Merlin, "when the 11 kings are weary, let King Bors and King Ban come forth. Then surely the courage of our enemies will fall." The plan was carried out, and Arthur's men marched down the passage. The green wood was on one side, and on the other side was the lake, the water of which was so clear that it reflected the bodies of the soldiers with their shields and helmets. The sun shone on their armor. The little birds in the woods sang as they passed. But the men were thinking of nothing but the expected battle. When they had come close to the enemy, they saw the 11 kings all in a row, mounted on big, handsome horses. Their 50,000 men were behind them. Suddenly, these rode forward, and the battle began. It was a fierce fight. In a very short time, the field was covered with overthrown men and horses. Broken shields and helmets lay on the ground. and many of the knights who had been fighting on horseback were unhorsed and were fighting on foot. Arthur galloped here and there among his enemies, conquering with his trusty sword all with whom he fought. The woods and the water rang with his sword strokes. The noise drowned the songs of birds, but they still sang and flew about gaily, all unaware of the grim death struggle going on beneath them. Finally, the time arrived for bringing forward King Bors and his men. The great dark king went thundering down upon his enemies. When the king of Orkney saw him coming, he cried, "Oh, we are in great danger. I see King Bors, one of the best and bravest kings in the world, and he is helping our enemy." Then the other kings were astonished, for they did not know that Arthur had sent outside his country for help. "But we will fight on," they said, "no matter how powerful he is." While they were still fighting, but with great loss of courage, they heard the loud sounds made by the hoofs of their trampling horses, and King Ban rode down on them, followed by his men. His black brows were frowning, and his green and gold colors glittered in the sun. "Alas, alas," cried the king of Orkney, "now in truth we are lost, for here is another king, no less great than his brother Bors, but we must neither flee nor yield." The 11 kings, being agreed to this, continued the battle, though so many of their men were killed that the king of Orkney wept. When he saw some of his men running away, he wept still more, for he thought it was better to die than to be a coward. Though they did not intend to run away, the 11 kings thought it would be wise to retreat to a little hill nearby. It was late, and they were tired and wished to rest before fighting again. King Bors and King Ban could not help admiring these rulers. "In truth," said King Ban, "they are the bravest men I ever saw. I would they were your friends." "Indeed, so would I," replied Arthur. "But I have no hope of that, for they are determined to destroy me, and so we must fight on." At this moment, Merlin rode up on his great black horse. "Have you not done enough?" he cried to Arthur. "Of their 60,000 men, there are left but 15,000. It is time to stop, I say. If you fight on, they will win the day. The tide will turn against you." Arthur hesitated, and Merlin said, "The 11 kings have a great trouble coming of which they are ignorant. The Saracens have landed in their countries to the number of over 40,000. So your enemies will have so much fighting to do that they will not attack you again for 3 years." Then Arthur was glad, for it had grieved him deeply to fight so long and to lose his good soldiers. "We will fight no more then," he said. "That is well," replied Merlin. "Now give presents to your soldiers, for today they have proved themselves equal to the best fighters in the world." "True indeed," exclaimed King Bors and King Ban. So Arthur gave gifts to his own men and a great deal of gold to the brother kings, both for themselves and for their soldiers. And the 2 kings went home rejoicing. And this, my darling, ends today's story time. As always, I hope that you have very sweet and creepy dreams. Good night.